Russia is showing great ingenuity with missile and electronic warfare technology. It's doing terribly badly for what it's got on the ground. And this is where you're right. Long term, it cannot go on at this level, consuming so much of its economy. I think it's got about 18 months. But it looks as if, to me, that Kiev, the regime, the war effort of Ukraine could crack.
Now, though, NATO leaders are gathering in Washington for their summit. It's the 75th anniversary of the organisation. And, of course, it's taking place amid electoral chaos in France, as we've just been discussing, a new British administration, as we all know, and real questions about what's going to happen in the US presidential race. The NATO military alliance is expected to pledge a further 40 billion euros to Ukraine as Russia today has escalated its attacks on the country. Dozens of people were killed in Ukraine today as Russian missiles hit a children's hospital and a medical facility in Kyiv. So was that a deliberate attack timed to coincide with the summit? Joining me now is Robert Fox, the defence editor of the Evening Standard. I mean, Robert, I'm quite sure President Putin will be paying close attention to the NATO summit, or am I wrong?
Oh, yes, he does. He loves this. He loves the rhetoric. He likes mixing it with the leadership because he sees himself as the supreme Russian world leader, and that's what the scheme's about. And I think that's the thing that's going to be very difficult for NATO because, as you rightly sketch, the way the political climate is changing in Europe, as well as the possibility now of very strong possibility of Trump returning to power. Does that mean to say that we can draw a line under Ukraine? They've talked about peace. Why don't we give him what he wants? Although it's not quite clear what he wants. But I think of the new membership of NATO, and they're saying, well, even if you give him what he appears to be requiring, which is a very tall order, he won't stop with Ukraine. But what this also will be dominated by is the fact that NATO isn't just about Europe anymore. You've got another war going on. You have got real trouble blowing up in the Pacific, where NATO's powers and their capabilities will have a real play. And that's why
This is vis-a-vis what?
Well, we've got a very strange deadline. I'm sure people have mentioned it to you before, of 2027. 2027, that the Hawks say that's when you've got to watch out because it looks as if Xi is going to make his first run at Taiwan then. Why? It's slightly tenuous. It's because there's in a document that he claims that he wants China to be a dominant, if not the dominant, global military power, at least a match or capable of overmatching America in 2027. So that's where we're going. So you've got two spiral crises, two systems of alliances which are in competition with each other. Russia, China on the one hand, America, NATO, Europe on the other.
And so what can we expect from this summit on either of those?
The first message is that they will begin at the beginning, as Dylan Thomas would say. And the beginning is Europe, which is what NATO was conceived for. And I think even the Brits are going to get a bit of a ticking off and saying that you've got to do more. You've got to do more. Well, yes, we know about the rhetoric. You can talk about the sums, the percentages of GDP, but physically you have got to have greater capability. And if anything points up the need for that, it's the attacks today on Kiev, because too many of the missiles and drones, but particularly the missiles, got through.
So that would mean giving air defences, would it?
Air defences, but also there is, sorry to be a bit grand, they've got to reconceive the air battle, which I think they've been lazy about for obvious political reasons, slow to put the F-16s in. If you're really going to stop this, and it's not just the Kinsale, the hypersonic missiles, which really got working today, more successful, I think, than ever. It's these standoff-launched, quite simple glide bombs from bombers, which can stand way back over Russian territory. And this is where we come back to Biden again, that he doesn't want American weapons overmuch to be used to attack Russian facilities in Russia.
I think it's fair to say you've always been fairly pessimistic about Ukraine and the defence of Ukraine. There are those on the other side of the argument who are saying that actually Russia can't support this level of attrition. Where do you think that the conflict is at the moment?
I think we're right in the middle. I think the use of the Kinzhal, this hypersonic missile, as well as the Iskander, they've got 4 or 5 weapon systems that are really working. Russia is showing great ingenuity with missile and electronic warfare technology. It's doing terribly badly for what it's got on the ground. And this is where you're right. Long term, it cannot go on at this level, consuming so much of its economy. I think it's got about 18 months. But it looks as if, to me, that Kiev, the regime, the war effort of Ukraine could crack. I don't see it any minute, but it could be weeks away. Things are very, very difficult indeed for them, and they need an awful lot more. The ammunition was held up. They have their own manpower problem, and this is why it's interesting, isn't it, that David Lammy, that Mr. Lammy went off to speak to the Poles, because the Poles are really hoisting the warning signs and saying there is trouble, and this thing could go down very quickly.
Now, I was talking yesterday to the former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt here on Times Radio, and he was saying that he thought the Biden situation and people just looking at President Biden and thinking, is he up to it, is going to become the dominant thing at this summit for the other leaders. Do you think so?
I think it's very much in the background. I wonder if they're too polite to bring it up to the foreground. Certainly, I can't see Keir Starmer doing it. But he ought to, because it's funny you talking about Macron, who is, I would say, in global, being the leader of European defence, he is fatally damaged. Scholz is not in good shape. So you're really going to say that the two medium power leaders are going to be Keir Starmer and Giorgia Meloni, which is the way it could appear at this NATO summit, and they must be very worried about what's going in the US leadership, and I think it will go through this conference like the lettering through Brighton Rock.
And do you think you say you don't think they'll have the courage to say to him quietly, Joe, you've done a good job, but time to hang up your boots?
One person we haven't talked about is Mark Rutte.
The new Secretary General of
he's
NATO.
New, but there's quite a lot. He's not an old man. He's a very vigorous man. He is very, very experienced and quite an old fox. I think he'll be saying to himself, I've taken over I'm the helmsman on this alliance, and the leader, the paramount leader, is the US. I'm caught between Biden and Trump. Now, how am I going to work this out? And Mark Rutte is a great worker out. He's much less obvious in his tactics than Stoltenberg and the Scandinavians. I think he's going to be a very critical figure. And Starmer has got to make his number with Mark Rutte. Otherwise, I think that if they're all going to operate at a distance, it's going to be very, very difficult indeed, because a lot of the governments in the NATO alliance, some of the Scandinavians, they're not that strong either.
Do you see any changes in the British defence posture and British role in NATO with the change of government, with Keir Starmer becoming Prime Minister?
Yes, I think it's a real decision point. We've been talking about it at the Royal United Services Institute this morning. I think what you've got with Starmer and John Healey is a new sense of realism, and we've got to get real. There's a hell of a lot that the previous administration has talked about British military capability, which is just nonsense. There are good bits, but they don't hang together at the moment. And above all, the army doesn't work. And that's what they've done very good things in terms of advice, a lot more than we've declared in Ukraine. But as a working fighting force, medium level, that can give real leadership in NATO, they're not there yet. And that is one thing that will be required of them very practically in Washington in the next 2 days.